The way we think of color, why we think things work together, why they're pleasing to look at when they're combined, is because the colors have a recognizable relationship. We don't usually consciously know what that relationship is, but by the time you're done with this podcast, you will actually know what that relationship is. Hello, all my brilliant creatives out there. Thank you for joining me on the Sage Arts Podcast. This is Sage, and we are starting out the month of April here today with another color, I don't want to say lesson, well, color revelation, let's say. Color revelations is actually plural. We're going to be talking about the ways to use some of the information I gave you last month. So ideally, if you can, you want to listen to the color mix-up episode, which was on the 10th of March, so episode 53, I believe. That would keep you on track with the conversation, although I am going to review a lot of the terminology. So if you haven't listened to it and you don't want to jump over to it right now, you'll still be able to get something out of this episode. But then maybe just go back and listen to that episode so you'll be able to get more out of what you've learned in this one, and then you could even review this one afterwards to get that information to really sink in. But in any case, what we're going to talk about today was actually really revolutionary to me when I first figured it out. I was taught this kind of not the terminology that made sense to me. So now I have terminology that I think makes so much better sense than the way it's normally talked about. So hopefully it will be the same for you. So sit back, get a cup of tea or coffee or wine or whatever it is you want. And if you have a color wheel on hand, that might be helpful for you. I will have some more visuals for you that I will put up on Instagram at the Sage Arts Podcast page, and will be in the newsletter. But it's not going to be as necessary as last week's visuals were to really understand the material. If you have a color wheel, especially a CMY color wheel, ideally. And if you don't, maybe hit pause real quick, bring some up on your phone or tablet or computer, whatever, or any that you have on hand. And that will help you better visualize what I'm going to talk about. So get that if you need it, and kick back if you want to metaphorically come join me in the podcast room. The lounge is empty. The puppy is on the ground on her little donut bed, and she's just staring up at me, wondering when we're going to be done and go play again. But it's otherwise nice and cozy in here. So come on in, join me, and let's talk color. Today, I'm actually going to talk to you about what kind of logically would have come at the end of a color class if I was doing an actual color class. But I'm going to give it to you now so you receive this additional information with something that you can kind of apply it to or root it in, so to speak, something that you can literally do with it. Because I know for me and for a lot of other people, understanding something usually takes working with it, being able to actively do something with it. So that's what I'm going to try to give you today. So basically, what I'm going to do is give you a kind of formula for combining colors, for developing color palettes and understanding why some colors work together and why others don't. And it's not going to be a restrictive kind of formula, and formula is maybe not the right word, but I think it gives you the idea that, yes, you can think in terms of this terminology and way of looking at it, and it should help you tremendously in determining either the color combinations that you want to use or when color combinations aren't working for you. But it won't take anything away from like an intuitive method of color choosing or the kind of visceral reactions that we have and judge our color combinations by. I know when I choose colors to go together, I usually do it very intuitively, but I also have been working with color for a very long time. So I don't usually have to ask myself if they work together and go through the reasons why I know they should or shouldn't. So if you work with these parameters I'm going to give you, if you work with it long enough, you will get to that point as well where you'll just know. But first, super quick, brief business stuff. First, if you have any comments or stories or anything that you want to tell me, criticism, whatever, please do write me at sagearts.com. There's a contact page there. You can also message me on Instagram or Facebook. A lot of you reached out to me on Instagram lately. I really appreciate all the comments and the feedback there. Thank you so much. And if you want to support the podcast and give back, you can do so by contributing through Buy Me a Coffee or the PayPal buttons you'll find on the homepage about halfway down that front page. And then if you want to keep up with this kind of off schedule that I had lately, and it may get even more off, I'm really trying not to take time off, but I have a lot of travel and some other things coming up that it's going to really be busy through June for me. I'm going to see if I can pre-record, but I'm going to be going to an every other week or twice a month thing. I'm not exactly sure what I can manage. Still trying to figure that out, and I apologize for the inconsistency. But If you get the newsletter, and you can do so by going to the homepage and hitting the news and notices button, you will get notices when it's out. If you hit the follow button on your podcast player, we'll also let you know when a new episode is out. And the newsletter also gives you when I have extra materials or extra news or whatnot, it'll all be in there. So just click that news and notices button on the homepage of thesagearts.com. And I'm just going to leave the business stuff at that because we have a lot to cover today. And I don't want to overwhelm you because for a lot of people, this stuff is kind of daunting. But today is going to be really exciting. I promise you, you will end up with an understanding of color, if you don't have it already, that I think will really, like I said, revolutionize the way you look at color and choose color. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's first talk about the kind of standard color combination formulas, color schemes that have been promoted for, I don't know, decades, maybe centuries. Things like complementary and analogous and triadic. And all of those, they're perfectly wonderful and useful ways of choosing color. And a lot of us do turn to that. And I still use that to some extent. But I think those kinds of guidelines are restrictive and they don't feed into the message of your work. They don't consider a lot of things other than hue. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So in this conversation, I'm not saying to throw those out if those work for you, but you may want to expand beyond those because they are very restrictive in what they actually show you. Now, my explanations for how I choose color is actually going to be applicable to all of these color schemes, and that also will need to be explained. But let's just talk about standard color schemes very quickly. The familiar color schemes for most people are things like complementary color, which is picking two colors that are opposite each other on a color wheel. Now, the problem I have with this kind of thought, and all of these actually color schemes, are based on color wheels, or at least the way they're explained or the way you can find them is like grab a color wheel and you can pick the colors that are directly across from each other and go, okay, those are complementary. Now, if you're using an RYB, red, yellow, blue color basis for your color wheel and for your color mixing, they're not going to line up the same way as if you use a CMY color wheel. Because in CMY, the primary colors, which are the ones that cannot be mixed by any other color, are cyan, magenta, and yellow. And the secondaries are red, green, and blue. Now, in a RYB color wheel, red, yellow, blue color wheel, the secondaries are orange, purple, and green. Did you notice orange and purple were not, actually it's violet, not purple technically, but violet and orange doesn't come up in the primary or secondaries in a CMY. So the idea that blue's opposite orange doesn't even come into play if you're just looking at those 6 colors on the CMY color wheel. So it might seem a little off to you if you're transitioning from a RYB to a CMY wheel. It's going to look new to you because the opposites of things that you've always been told, green is opposite of red and purple is opposite of yellow. Those aren't complementary colors on a CMY wheel. But I think if you use CMY, you'll see that the color combinations, the complementary colors are actually a more vibrant combination. But there's also something called analogous color combinations, color schemes. And that's where, like, if you are using a RYB, that you can see that red and green can go together, even though they're not direct complements on a CMY wheel. But it still works because those colors that are shown as complements on an RYB wheel will fall into a color scheme, either the triadic or split complementary, which I'll explain in just a moment, on a CMY wheel. So this is where you might want to follow along with a color wheel in hand or on a screen or something in front of you, because you'll see how this will happen. The things that you thought were complementary will end up triadic or split complementary. And just make note of that as we go along. Okay, so besides complementary color schemes, there's monochromatic colors, which is just choosing everything within the same hue. And then there's triadic, which is actually picking 3 colors that are equidistant from each other. So cyan, magenta, and yellow are all primaries, but they're equidistant from each other. Red, green, and blue are also equidistant and make a triadic color scheme. And there is one of those cases where the red and green, which we always thought was opposite on an RYB color wheel, are triadic instead, but they still work together. But anything where the colors are equidistant, 3 colors are equidistant from each other, would make up a triadic scheme. And then there's split complements, where instead of choosing 2 colors directly opposite each other, you start with your one base hue, and then the complement of that hue, you pick the colors on either side of its complement. So if you start with blue, the opposite of blue on a CMY wheel is yellow. But if you're wanting to do a split complement color palette, you would choose blue and orange and yellow green. And there you go. There's another one that was a traditional complement understanding in an RYB wheel, blue and orange, right? We always thought those were opposite. And on a CMY wheel, orange is a split complement to blue and vice versa. So they do work together. They're just not the complements we thought they were. And then there's also tetradic, which is putting like basically 4 colors that are equidistant from each other on a color wheel, which actually forms a square if you drew lines between them. So like a 4-color scheme. So those are common color schemes that you can identify using a color wheel. But there is a problem, not just with the color scheme's limitations, but the fact that we're using it based on a wheel. I'm not saying that the wheel's not good. It's a great way to categorize and organize our color and to be able to look at the relationships between them. But we don't think like that. We don't think in terms of the colors being on a wheel in our mind. That's not our relationship with how we see color out in the world. The problem with using a color wheel when you're thinking about how these colors go together is that it's a purely logical construct that has nothing to do with how we actually see color and react to color and look at color out in the world. We don't have a color wheel in our minds, most of us, maybe some people do, but it's not how we think of color. It's not how we relate to color. We don't do it from the basis of some kind of wheel in our brains. The key thing, and here's the key thing, this is the thing that you want to take away from all of this, is that the way we think of color, the way we see color, why we think things work together, why they're pleasing to look at when they're combined, is because the colors have a recognizable relationship. Now, we don't usually consciously know what that relationship is, but by the time you're done with this podcast today, you will actually know and understand what that relationship is for most, pretty much all color combinations. So it's about relationship. It's about recognizing what are the connections between these colors that make them relate to each other. Now, with anything out in the world, you can be related by similarity or differences. And in color, you're mostly looking at similarity relationships. That's what is key to combining colors, is finding characteristics that are the same amongst each of the colors in a restricted color palette. And I say restricted because if you're talking about a painting or a mosaic or anything with just colors all over the place, it's all kinds of colors, you're picking a scene out in the world. Nature doesn't sit there and go, I'm going to just pick these 3 colors and use this as my color palette for this scene. It doesn't do that, right? There's just colors everywhere, all kinds of things. So it's not going to relate to, I'm going to realistically depict this scene in front of me, or I want a certain kind of energy in this mosaic, but I want quieter sections. So I'm going to use different colors over here. I'm going to use pastel colors over here, and I'm going to use more saturated colors over here. Those are different than picking a restricted color scheme where you're just going to use 2 or 3 or 4 colors, that kind of thing. So that's what I'm going to speak to, is the restricted color scheme today. There are 2 things about this relationship in color that you will come to recognize. And one is the commonality, which I was just talking about, the common characteristic that will be true in all of the colors. And it may be one characteristic that's in common or multiple characteristics that are in common. And then there's also contrast. And we will actually get to contrast later because that has to do with value. But those are the things that I look for in my color choices, as that what are the common characteristics that I'm using to tie these all together? And then what kind of contrast do I want? You can have high contrast or low contrast. You can have a lot of dark colors and maybe one light color, or you can have a lot of light colors or a lot of dark colors or whatever. So you determine the contrast based on your message. And that's going to be another podcast episode where we talk about how to use color to relay message, to relay feeling, to relay emotion, and get the kind of reaction you want out of your viewers. So let's dive into this commonality of characteristics. And the kind of characteristics that make relationships in colors are things that we've already talked about. So if you listen to the last episode, you'll be familiar with these. But before I go over those, just keep in mind, and I've already kind of mentioned this, but it's really important. Keep in mind, no color palette, no combination of colors has to include all or most of these characteristics I'm going to talk about. Having more in common also doesn't mean it's going to be a better color combination. In fact, sometimes only having one characteristic in common is what makes the color combination energized and exciting and really beautiful. But any combination of colors should have one color characteristic in common at least. Also, some of these will have a more solid connection between the colors than others. I'll let you know about the ones that might have a weaker link to connect the colors so you know when to consider maybe having more than one characteristic in those sets because of those characteristics being a little bit harder to recognize. And that's what we're doing when we see a set of colors that we like. We are recognizing a relationship. And so when that relationship is hard to recognize, sometimes we don't find the color combination quite as pleasing. Just keep that in mind as we go through these characteristics and you start thinking about how you use these characteristics and whether you can recognize those characteristics in your color combinations. Let's start with the color characteristic hue. So if all your colors have a base hue that they all have in common, then that can be a pleasing color combination. So let's say you take the color red and you want that to be your base hue that all your colors have in common. You can go from a warm yellow, and if you remember the color bias that we talked about last time, if you go to the warm yellow, which leans into the red, which means that yellow may have a little bit of, it's actually magenta in it, but we'll visually kind of see it as being leaning into orange, which means it's leaning towards red. So it has some red in it. And you can go all the way the other direction into a red magenta, which also has a little red in it. So you can have a warm yellow, red, and a red magenta, and that color combination has a hue characteristic in common. And so we would recognize that as having a relationship, and we will think, yes, those colors go together. Now, I want to note that when we're talking about hue, we are talking about terms, like names of the common sets of colors. So in my color combination querying that I do, if I have to like figure out what colors aren't working together, I just use 6. Cyan, magenta, and yellow because they're the primaries, and then red, green, and blue because those are the secondaries, and I work everything off of that. But you can use your primaries, your secondaries, which are, if you don't remember from last week, are when you combine 2 primaries and you get that middle color between them. And then there's tertiary. So you're combining a primary and a secondary, and the mix you get in between the primary and the secondary on a color wheel is known as tertiary. So here's a good point to stop and reference your color wheel again. So you'll see your tertiaries between, say, cyan and blue, cyan being primary, blue being a secondary. Blue cyan is the tertiary. If you go between, let's see, yellow and red, it's actually orange is the tertiary. So yellow being the primary and red being the secondary, orange is their tertiary. So note that on the CMY, the tertiaries are orange, red magenta, violet, blue cyan, green cyan, and yellow green. Now, tertiaries, both on an RYB and CMY wheel, are usually hyphenated versions of primaries and secondaries, like the yellow green, or on a RYB, you have red violets and that kind of thing. I think these are hard to track, regardless of which color basis, RYB or CMY primary colors that you're using. So that's why I just usually stick with 6, and then everything else in terms of color bias or base hue or whatever tends to be off of those basic 6. But we do also have a strong familiarity with orange and violet or purple. And so if you want to use those as well, because it's familiar, that's fine. It doesn't really matter as long as you are finding that commonality between your colors. So it can be any number of colors that you're using as your base hues, and then you just want a set of colors to be related. If hue is going to be their point of commonality, it's all going to be colors within a 1/3 portion of the wheel, because all the colors will have one of your primaries from that 1/3. I don't know if that makes sense. If you're looking at a color wheel, look at 1/3 of it and you can say all those colors can be put together, having a hue in common. And then let's talk about saturation. And I kind of feel like I have to talk about saturation, shade, tint, tone, and neutral colors all at the same time, because saturation is how pure a color is, which means it has no shade or tint or tone if it's fully saturated. It's a pure hue. So these characteristics are kind of related, but they each would be a separate characteristic that could be recognized as commonality. So let's start with saturation. And if all the colors are fully saturated, then they're going to look like they go together. And you can pick them from anywhere on the color wheel, and they'll look like they go together because we're like, oh yeah, I see the relationship. They're all really bright, pure colors, right? And then if you choose to move away from full saturation, you do so by shading, tinting, toning, or neutralizing your color. So shading, if you don't remember, is when you add black to it. Tints are adding white to it. Tone is when, okay, these terms get kind of mixed up. So Tone is when you add gray, so black and white, but it's also used to talk about adding complementary color to your hue, because basically you end up with the same thing, either mud or gray, if there is a predominance of gray added or a complementary color added. Because theoretically, if you had a pure magenta, yellow, and cyan, and you put them together, you'd end up with black. But in pigment colors, which is what most of us deal with, you end up with a mud or a brown or a grayish brown color. When you add the complement of a color, one hue, like take red, which on the CMY color wheel, the opposite of that is cyan. If you add cyan into red, if you remember from last week, you'll end up with a mud because red has yellow and magenta in it. And so now you have all three primary colors, and you mix all three primary colors, you start getting muddy colors. And that's what will neutralize the hue, reduce the saturation. And so the colors that you are combining become neutralized because they're not true to either hue, right? Hope that makes sense. It's so hard trying to do an auditory lesson for something so visual. But regardless of what you call it, when you have a common desaturation amongst your colors, so let's say you have a lot of colors that are shaded, but they're all shaded, right? They all have black in them. We'll recognize that they've all had black added to them and that they're shaded colors. Tint, which is actually probably a better example because we all know what a tinted color looks like because we even have a name for it, and that's pastels. So if you have a combination of pastel colors, they can be picked anywhere off the color wheel from the original hue. If they only have white added to them, they will all go together. Same if they're all toned down with both gray, or both white and black, which is gray. If they're toned down with gray, you'll see that as well. Neutralizing with the complementary color can take a little finesse because it depends on how much they're neutralized by the complementary color as to whether they feel like they fit together. If they're all equally neutralized, they'll probably work together, but it also might have low energy. So there is some intuitive sense that still is needed, but you're able to recognize if there is neutralization across the board on all the colors that you've chosen, you'll know that they work together. But if you want more energy, maybe make them less neutral. So the neutrals may actually be one of those that is a bit of a weaker link for the relationship. So if you have a lot of neutral colors, you might try to gain another characteristic, like say the base hue is a commonality as well. And then another characteristic that you can also include is temperature. So you could have all cool colors or all warm colors, but that is kind of harder for us to recognize because if you look at your color wheel, your warms can be everything from a yellow-green to a magenta. And yellow, green, magenta just seems so different, but they actually go together really, really well. But in any case, you can have all warm or all cool colors, but if two of those colors are really kind of distant from each other on the spectrum, they may not feel as comfortable, or they may not feel as well matched. But again, there's a lot of intuitiveness and visceral reaction that you're going to want to read into it. And when we get to trying to use color to help project a message or feeling or whatnot, that'll help answer some of the questions about like why you would use colors that are more disparate in a color palette or not. So if you choose color temperature, you might want to also have a commonality such as being tinted or shaded or toned or neutralized or the hue, right? So if you get another characteristic there in common, that will help people recognize the relationship that those colors have. So those are the common color characteristics that you want to look for to see what relationship these colors have to each other. Now, there's kind of an exception. Well, this is art. There's always an exception. And there's always reasons not to do what we're doing. Like you might not want the colors to have any relationship, so they're really disparate, so it's very uncomfortable. Maybe that's the feeling or message that you're trying to get across. So that's always a possibility. But there's also something else about relationships with color that has nothing to do with characteristics, and that has to do with familiarity. For instance, everything from a lime green to a dark forest green and everything in between can really go with any other color, especially the bright colors. Because in nature, we see this wide range of flowers and fruit in just every color in the rainbow, right? But they're all set against a background or in combination with foliage that's some version of green usually. Sometimes there's a version of the foliage at different times of the year that's redder or yellower or whatnot. But green and most other colors are something that we see all the time in plants out in the world. So the familiarity of that allows us to see a relationship between them based on things that we've already seen before, things that we think are natural. But, and caveat to this as well, there's probably a lot of exceptions to this, but think of this. If you have a dark green and a pale pink, if you think about characteristics, there is no hue common characteristic. There is no, there might be some black in the green, but there's not in the pink. There's some white in the pink, but probably not in the dark green. There's not, maybe there's a tone, maybe the green has a neutralization to it because it's not like super saturated, but the pink probably is. And pink is a warm color and green is a cool color. So there's no temperature commonality either. So they're very different, but they work together because we see roses, deep green leaves and those beautiful pink roses. And they just look really good together because, well, basically nature can do no wrong because we're used to seeing just whatever combination out in nature. And once there's that familiarity, it's like having a preset understanding, a preset recognition of commonality. And it's basically just that it's out in nature. Now, when you use these not common characteristic colors and you choose something from nature, I think they tend to work better. And again, there's always exceptions when they're used in an organic setting, like when the other elements in the work are also organic line, organic shapes, organic textures. They help remind us and call back why that relationship works. So if you had something with flowing lines and very like hand-drawn shapes, and you use the dark green and the pink, it might come across just fine. But think about doing that and then think about doing like something with very geometric, man-made, sharp lines and shapes. It doesn't feel right. And I think it's because of the recognition that the relationship between those colors is nature and not man-made. So now knowing that the relationship and a recognizable relationship between colors can establish a great color combination for you, why has there been such a push for those initial color schemes that we talked about? Those complementary, split complementary, triadic, etc. So this information is going to be more kind of like the cool trivia stuff, but it also just kind of fills in the blanks of the whys. Why do these work? Why are these things satisfying to us? Well, those traditional color schemes, they're actually scientifically based, although I don't think anybody realized that until more recently. But we find complementary colors pleasing, analogous colors pleasing, because the way the light from those colors enter our eyes, they engage various photoreceptor cells in our eyes. And complementary colors will initiate action in all of them. So our eyes are happy because everything's getting to play. It's kind of like taste. If you've ever done any like taste testing or whatnot, you'll notice that when more sections of your tongue are able to taste all the, the wide variety of flavors that we can taste, food seems more satisfying. It seems richer and fuller and more interesting to us because all the various types of taste buds get to play. And it's the same thing for our eyes. The more our senses get to play, the more they get to take part in what's going on, the more pleasing it is for us in our brains. And that's not to say that when only one set of photoreceptors, one type of photoreceptor is being initiated, that it isn't a good thing as well, because like monochromatic can be very soothing because the energy is low and calming and not complicated. And that can also be, depending on the message and the thing that you want to convey, a very pleasing type of color scheme as well. So just know that that is a physiological basis for why we enjoy certain combination of colors or react to combinations of colors in those particular ways. Okay, so now are you beginning to see how you could define what you're going to choose for a color palette or a restricted or limited color scheme by just recognizing the relationship between the colors chosen or your options that you might choose? I think the next thing that might be a hurdle for some people is just being able to see those characteristics in a color. And there's no trick for that. There's no formula for seeing that. But I think it does really help if you have a good color wheel to be able to put that up next to a color, or at least have it in hand and be able to look back and forth and say, that green, does it seem to lean a little bit more towards yellow than blue? Or, am I seeing it neutralized? How does its saturation compare to the saturation on a color wheel, which should be a fully saturated color on the outside? And then if you have the color wheels that I sell on the 10thmusearts.com website, TNTHMUSEARTS.com. I had to stop and think how far I got on the spelling there. But those color wheels also show neutral and tints and shades on I think tints and shades are on the back side and neutrals or tones are on the center of the front side. And you can see how the colors change as they move towards the middle ranges from pure saturation to no saturation. No saturation just means there's no color hue in it at all. And if you start familiarizing yourself with those concepts and a color wheel, although like I said earlier, we don't think in terms of wheels. And so that wheel relationship is just an easy way to organize our colors and our ideas. But in order to be able to recognize what's in a color, you just need to become familiar with how those colors differ from one stage to the next. What does it look like when this particular color has black in it? What does this look like when it has white in it? And what does this one look like if I have a complement in it? And of course, you can practice this by mixing your materials if you have a mixable material. If you have anything that allows you to make your own colors, then you'll be able to instantly see it by putting it together. And if you don't have something, I would recommend that you get something like acrylic paints, or you get craft paints, hobby paints. It doesn't really matter what it is, or polymer clay. I'm always a big proponent of polymer clay because it's easy to work with. It's not messy. It's easy to clean up afterwards. And if you do that, go out and get the closest thing to cyan, magenta, and yellow that is available, and a black and a white. And with those 5 colors, and you can get it in paint too, by the way, but with those 5 colors, you can mix anything that you want. So set yourself up for some color mixing fun, and then you can see how adding black or white or gray or a complementary color affects the color up close and personal. So that's a great way to get used to seeing and understanding what is included in a color. But I think the other way around is also as important, maybe even more important, to find existing colors and then try to define, ask yourself, quiz yourself, what is in this color? What is the primary hue? Is it shaded or tinted or toned or neutralized? Is it a warm color or a cool color? And once you've got that down, go and look at preset color palettes or other people's color palettes. Like you can even just go into Google or whatever your search engine is and just put in color palettes and go to the images pages and look at all the color palettes and see if you can't identify what that commonality is. If you spent enough time looking at individual colors, I'm pretty sure you're going to start recognizing them very, very quickly. Then just doing that will hone your eye until you get to the point where you're going to just look at colors and know that's related to this one because they both have neutral tones, but this is related to that one because they're both shades. Get the familiarity down, and then you'll get to a point where you won't have to really think about what the colors are, and you'll just recognize their commonalities and their relationship. Okay, so yeah, that's the lesson I would hope that you would get to focus on this month. And it's springtime. We have wildflowers like crazy out here because of all the rain that we've gotten. So I'm going to be able to go out and actually do this exercise if I want on flowers, which is fun. And you can totally do that. You can do it with anything. It doesn't have to be art materials. It can be your clothes in your closet. It can be when you're out shopping. It can be food in the produce section or the labels on packaging or whatever. It doesn't matter. Just get that practicing, get that familiarity in. It will become pretty much automatic if you do it often enough. And I think for most people, just doing it throughout the month, a little bit each day, and by the end of the month, you won't even have to think about the color relationships and any specific terms. You'll just know, yeah, these are related, and something in you will tell you, these are all tints, these are all shades, these are whatever. And then having this specific information in your head will allow you to analyze something when it doesn't look like it's working. When you're like, these colors don't seem to be fitting well together. I'm not satisfied with these colors. You can start looking at those relationships and then play around with other colors with an eye to identifying those relationships, those commonalities that make them work together. If you have any questions on that, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. The sagearts.com contact page is one of the best ways to get a hold of me. If you get the newsletter, because you hit that news and notices button on the homepage of the sagearts.com, you will be able to reply directly to that newsletter and ask me questions if you want to do it that way. You can get on social media, on Instagram or Facebook, go to the Sage Arts podcast pages, and you can shoot me direct messages or something on the posts. And if you find these podcast episodes useful and you really get something out of it and you want to give back, I have a Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal donation pages. You can find the links for that about halfway down the homepage at thesagearts.com. But there's also all of these links. Everything I mentioned here are also in the show notes or description section of wherever it is that you are listening to this podcast from. And speaking of podcast players, if you can take a moment and hit the follow button on your podcast player, or if you're listening to this via YouTube, subscribe. That way you'll know when the new episodes come out, and it also helps promote us on search lists. And if you'd like, you can also leave a review on your podcast player for this podcast so other people will know what you think of it and the reasons why they may want to listen to it as well. With that, I'm just going to keep this a little shorter than I have been, because I think that is more than enough to keep you occupied with trying to learn something new this month and up your game, up your design knowledge. So with that, I am going to get River together, and we're going to go out and play out in the spring hills out here and all the wildflowers. I'm so excited. It's just gorgeous out here. So you do the same in whatever variation. Get out and feed your muse and just be inspired by the world outside. Be true to your weirdness as always, and join us again next time on the Sage Arts Podcast.